Hello, Stephen Bedard here, and I want to look at the question of whether or not there is any first century Jewish evidence for the historical Jesus. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that on Twitter, one of my posts from my JesusMythTheory.com website came up, and there was some pushback by a number of people. The post was on the Jewish evidence of Jesus, and some of the comments I got on that tweet was that's not a thing. So they're saying that there is no evidence, Jewish evidence for Jesus. Another person said, "You mean the obvious fraudulent testimonium Flavianum that was added to Josephus' writings by Christians long after Josephus died?" And then another person saying, quoting what I had, "Is there any Jewish evidence for the historical Jesus? No." So they're saying that there really isn't any Jewish evidence for the historical Jesus. Are their criticisms correct? Do they have a basis in fact? Well, we'll have to take a look at that. So I guess we can start with Josephus, since he's the most obvious for a lot of people when they think of first century Jewish history. Does Josephus say anything about Jesus? Well, he says something about John the Baptist that is very closely connected to Jesus. So that is a piece of evidence, although not directly about Jesus, but it certainly emphasizes that a big part of Jesus' early years, his connection with John the Baptist, that John the Baptist was a historical figure. But you know what? It is possible that John the Baptist was a historical figure and Jesus wasn't. Although Josephus does refer to Jesus when he talks about James, the brother of Jesus, and that passage is accepted by Josephus scholars as being a authentic passage from Josephus. And for those critics who would say, no, it is something that was added later, they would say that only because of what they believe about the third relevant passage from Josephus, which is the Testimonium Flavianum. And that is a Josephus giving a very short description of who Jesus was. And the reason that some people think that that is a complete fraud when it comes to that, that it is something that is added later, is because when we look at that passage the way it is now, it certainly looks like some Christian has added to it. But there are a number of options. One is that yes, indeed, that Josephus never said anything about Jesus, and some Christian added something created out of whole cloth, and it was their own invention. Another option is that Josephus did say what is found in our copies of Antiquities now, that Jesus did all those things, including rising from the dead and all of that. Even though it sounds really Christian, maybe Josephus just did share that. So that is an option as well, although not likely. The third option, which seems to be what most scholars accept, is that Josephus said something about Jesus and that some Christian came later and added to it. And that really is what a lot of scholars, and I'm not talking about evangelical scholars, I'm not even talking about Christian scholars, I'm just talking scholarship in general, seems to lean towards that Josephus did say something and someone else later on added to it, and has caused all kinds of problems for us since then. So that by itself would be some Jewish evidence for the historical Jesus. But there's more, really. What about the Gospels? What about Paul? Now, you might be saying, well, no, you can't count that as Jewish evidence for Jesus because they are Christian. Well, we'll set aside Luke for now, which, according to tradition, was written by a Gentile Christian. But let's even just focus on Matthew and Mark, which seem to have been written by Jewish Christians. Why would that not be considered to be a Jewish writing? Now, I realize that today there's all kinds of controversy whether or not a Messianic Jew is still a Jew. Have they left that identity? Are they now Christians instead of Jewish? I realize that is a modern discussion that goes on. But in the ancient world, the first followers of Jesus would have identified as Jewish. His disciples would have identified as Jewish. Jesus would have identified as Jewish. Paul would have identified as Jewish. And so there is actually no reason not to include that in the Jewish evidence for Jesus. In the ancient world, seeing a particular person as being the Messiah did not end their Jewish identity. In fact, we find that a lot of the conflict that was going on in the early church was between those followers of Jesus who held on to their Jewish identity and those that did not, and those who did not have a Jewish identity to begin with. So that's where a lot of that conflict was. So that's presupposing that there are Jesus followers who are following, are holding on to that Jewish identity. So when we take a look at Matthew, Matthew seems to be very interested in showing how Jesus fulfills the prophecies of the Tanakh, and that is very much a part of a Jewish message of Jesus that's being shared there. And it looks like Mark is a Jewish Christian who is sharing the message of Jesus for a Gentile audience. So that is some Jewish evidence for the historical Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean that any of those people that commented on my tweet will be satisfied. I'm sure that they won't be. But the fact is that there is Jewish evidence for the historical Jesus. It doesn't mean you have to like it. It doesn't mean you have to accept it. But historians would accept that as actual Jewish evidence for Jesus. If you're interested in digging into the conversation more about whether or not there is historical evidence for Jesus, I'd encourage you to check out my website, JesusMythTheory.com, where I tackle the Jesus myth, the theory that there was no historical Jesus and that he was based on pagan myths. So please check out that website and make sure to subscribe to this channel. Thank you, and God bless.